It's April 2020. The coronavirus has taken the world by storm. People are required to shelter in place. With limited space, a lot of people are turning to raised beds and container gardens as an effective way to do their gardening. I'll show you how I turned an ugly battery box into a beautiful Asian-influenced cedar planter. As I was drawing up my plans, I got a little bit tired of constantly going outside to check the size of the planter and figure out what I'd missed. Our battery box has these extra bump outs that made things a little bit more challenging. It wasn't like just building a square box. So I decided rather than using a tape measure the whole time, I would make a story stick. This stick contains all of my measurements from the ground up on the length, width, height, bump outs, anything possible that I might need. Then from there, I created a second story stick that shows just the dimensions of my planter box that'll go around the outside edge of it. The bump outs on the side of my container mean that the width is not going to be the same as the depth when it comes to covering up the top part of the planter itself. So it took a little bit of careful planning. The story stick really helped, and my measurements are always going to be spot on the same. We're fortunate enough to live in the Pacific Northwest where cedar is in abundance. I always start by jointing the work on two sides before I take it to the bandsaw for further cutting down to size. That way I know my cuts will be square. After each cut on the bandsaw, if I don't have a second side that's been jointed, I make sure I repeat that process of jointing before cutting again. The rest of the boards for the planters are coming from stock we've milled from our property. I've got my two legs here, actually 4 legs, that I've cut and jointed on two sides and then planed down on the other two sides to make sure that everything was square and exact measurements. Then I cut the ends off to ensure I don't have any splits on the ends or checking. For the length, I'll be using my story stick. I've got a razor blade stuck into it at the point where the rafter and leg length will be. You can set that length on the table by bringing the razor blade just to the point where it's going to be cutting. And then I'll mark that with my guide so that all my lengths come out correctly. No measuring required. I always think it's important to take a look at the grain of the wood. This particular piece has 4 sides that are nice and straight. Decided that this is my best part forward. I'm also putting the grain crossways on each of the top pieces so that my joinery works the same way. The second piece has a side that has a little bit more face grain to it rather than the straight grain. I decided that this matches up well with the first piece. And the third piece, again, I have face grain on one side. I decided that's going to face inward towards the front, partially because my grain is running across it. And for the fourth one, it has 2 pieces, 2 sides that are face grain. So I'm not really worried about this little marking in here. I'd rather make sure my legs are the right sizes. So there we go. I number them 1, 2, 3, and 4 so that I always have them in the same position and oriented the same direction as I build my project together. 1 being my front left corner as I look at the front of the box. For the joinery of the legs, I've set my square to 1 3/4 of an inch, which is the depth of the rafters. And I mark each of the sides where that is. This is the depth of where I want my mortise to go. I've set my gauge. This is going to give me an even distance from either side, and I can adjust the thickness of the rafter joinery to match the mortise that I'm making here. I'm going to cut this out on the bandsaw. I'll make cuts, set up a stop block and cut into each of these. I've got the width set up to cut just inside of my marking. So when I flip it over all the way around on all sides, it'll eventually cut all the way around on both sides of the cut, and it'll be the same distance from the outside edge. Then after that, I'll put some spacers in to cut away a little bit more of the material before chopping it out. I've used a 1/2 inch gauge approximately for the width of that, and I've got a 1/2 inch chisel, so I can mark the end of this just by giving a good tap. I'll just chisel away each of these pieces in here to make a clean cut, and then we're ready for our joinery. I'm going to be using my story stick that I made to lay out the joinery for the rafters. On this particular board, I'm trying to ensure this is my inside because it's a little bit rough cut, not necessarily planed completely flat, but it is planed flat where I have the joinery and anything that's going to be showing out on the rafter tails. You can see I've got it already marked. And I lined up my 2 markings here that show where the side rafters go. The rafter is here and here. So I lined those up and ensured that my tails would be outside of these areas, that my joinery isn't going to be in the middle of a knot in the board, and that everything will work out okay. On the other side, it looks really clean. This is my show side. So I always start out with the legs, which are here and here. The other leg being here and there. The tails for the sides are there. The rafter ends there. So I know my length on it. I've marked where I'm going to be cutting this along here at 1 3/4 inches thick. The rafter tail itself adds another 3/4 of an inch, with the seating area, the covering, sitting down on top inside the tails at 5/8 of an inch thick. So I'll have a little bit of an offset between the seating and the top of my rafter tails. A complete drawing. Another one that's drawn up here already. I've got the legs coming through here, and this is the part that I need to cut away. And on this end, same thing. I actually used the leg from the inside marking to ensure that I've got the marking the same width as my leg, that way my joinery comes out correctly. I marked the center just so I know when I go to put the panels on where center is, so that I can line things up the way I want it to be. I've already marked the location of the legs, which would be right here and here. But for the thickness of the cutout, the leg will be coming up in like this to that point. I need to mark how much of the board gets cut away to receive the leg on either side. So it's kind of a saddle that I'm doing. And my mortise again is about a 1/2 inch wide. I wanted to go a little bit beefier on the tenon part of it, the saddle that goes in there. So rather than a 1/2 inch, I made it about an extra 1/16 of an inch wider so that I can actually pare it down as I need to rather than getting it too thin. Now this next step I could do just as easily on a table saw, but I prefer to use hand tools. I'll do that for all of the joinery that I need to do, and then I'll chisel that out. For chiseling out the portions, I have my mark here. I'm using a very wide chisel. I don't want to take away the whole thing. I'm going to take about half of it to start with. That way my depth is better and don't risk blowout. And lastly, I'll clean this up down to the line, down to my score line. Still just a little bit snug. I can probably ease that up, but it's hitting against unclean. This edge is not cleaned up well, so I can clean up my saw marks on the inside of this leg as well. I haven't done that yet. That'll make things go together smoothly. There we go. Now, this part will be cut away, and then I'll also be notching out 7/8 of an inch on the inside of this here, half the distance, following this mark, so that the other rafter tail can come on top of that and fit everything together. So this particular piece is for the side, so it goes on last on the top. The part I need to cut out then is this bottom part that will fit in with the opposite notch on the front trestle. So I'll mark the insides of the legs where that'll be cut out, and I need to make sure that I get everything up to that line. I'll be taking out a chunk 7/8 of an inch, half the depth. What I'm taking away is this part. Now I always mark which piece I'm going to be cutting out so that I know for sure, don't take the wrong part of the away from my wood. I'll cut that out on the bandsaw, and then we'll fit everything together. I'm going to start by making a couple of series of relief cuts to be able to cut the corner where the tail piece comes up. For these cuts, I'll just cut straight in and clean it up, and then finish it off with a chisel to get it nice and smooth. Now I'm going to just plane this down to the 1 3/4 inch mark that I have here. Everything will be good and smooth. The ends here I'm going to need to sand down on the drum sander to get down to my mark, because the plane won't go all the way to the end.